Hello and good evening to our alumni, friends, and indeed all of our audience tuning in tonight from Toronto and all around the world. My name is Claire Kennedy, a U of T engineering alumna, a co-chair of the university's Defy Gravity campaign, and your moderator for tonight's panel. Welcome to the latest installment of Disruptors and Dilemmas. Last Friday, the Government of Canada announced that COVID-19 vaccine developer Moderna will build a state-of-the-art manufacturing facility in Quebec to deliver made-in-Canada vaccines. When completed, this new facility will be able to produce up to 100 million COVID-19 vaccine doses annually and will lead to the creation of hundreds of new jobs in biomanufacturing. The new facility, which will begin operation in 2024 at the earliest, will also produce mRNA vaccines for other diseases such as influenza and perhaps some even more novel applications that we hope to hear about tonight. This is capacity that Canada currently doesn't have. So tonight's discussion is urgent and timely. And as we look to the future of biomanufacturing in Canada, our panel of experts is going to bring you key insights into what we've learned from our experience in the past 2 pandemic years and what we need to accomplish to ensure that we are well positioned for the next great challenge. Tonight, I'm really pleased to moderate this discussion among Omar Khan, Rav Kumar, Michael May, and Chris Yip as we talk about the future of vaccine production, giving biomanufacturing a shot in the arm. Prior to beginning our panel discussion this evening, I want to welcome the Dean of the Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering, Chris Yip. As some of our viewers are aware, Disruptors and Dilemmas is originally a speaker series from the Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering. Tonight's event is a special collaboration between U of T Engineering, U of T Mississauga, and the Leslie Dann Faculty of Pharmacy. Our original invite featured pharmacy professor and associate vice president and vice provost of strategic initiatives, Christine Allen. But unfortunately, Christine is not able to be with us tonight. We are delighted to have in her place not one, but 2 panelists, including Dean Yip. As Dean of Engineering, Chris is involved in a number of strategic projects in the biomanufacturing space. And we're also delighted to have joined the panel leading vaccine expert, Professor Omar Khan. But here to welcome everyone watching from all across U of T's disciplines is Professor Chris Yip. So over to you, Dean Yip.
Great, thanks, Claire. And it's really great to see so many of you here joining us this evening. And as Claire introduced, our topic today is it's about a challenge we've all experienced personally and started around this time a couple years ago. Anyways, as you all know, Canada is a rich country with a world-class healthcare system and plenty of biomedical and biomanufacturing expertise. And yet, we found ourselves waiting in long lines to receive our first vaccines against COVID-19, all of which were manufactured abroad. And so the story of how this happened and how to prevent it from happening again is really a story about how technical fields like chemistry, pharmacy, engineering sort of intersect with the economics, government policy, and business decisions that were made over the course of decades. And it really drives home a key point that really informs our mission here in U of T Engineering, which is really that the knowledge of science and technology is important, but on its own, it doesn't give you the full picture. And so here at U of T Engineering, we work hard to give tomorrow's engineering leaders the chance to augment their technical expertise with the ability to understand the context in which their innovations are applied. Whether this is through our Truce iLead initiative or our iStep, where we bring together different programs to do just that, linking engineering business minor and certificates to help students work in interdisciplinary teams, or whether it's our professional experience here, that 12 to 16 month opportunity to work full time. And as we're seeing now, in particular interest, so many of our students choosing to take their placements in the biomanufacturing and related industries, really giving them a hands-on view to what's involved in this particularly crucial industry right now. Some of our students are here with us tonight. I'm sure they're all looking forward, as we all are, to hearing from the panel that's being assembled, including myself, actually, really perfectly positioned to give us an understanding of the factors that I mentioned as they interact. So before I turn everything back to Claire, I want to thank her once again for the key role she's played in creating this series, Disruptors and Dilemmas. It's really a powerful series, a powerful opportunity and powerful conversations. And it's been going on for more than 10 years now, a really key forum for understanding some of the most complex and important challenges that we face as a society, both here in Toronto, but as we're seeing around the world. All comes down to Claire and her vision. And on behalf of everyone here, I do want to express how much we appreciate all that she's done on its behalf. And last, certainly not least, I want to thank our pillar sponsors, Manulife, TD Insurance, and MBNA. Thank you for making this space available for this really important conversation. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Claire to introduce the panel and to let's get started.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris, for teeing that up so well. Just a quick housekeeping item, and that is to our audience to send your questions in through the Q&A function that you should be able to navigate to on your Zoom screen. We have a lot of great staff who are pulling together questions, and we will do our best to get to as many of those questions as we can. It's now my honor as your moderator to present very briefly our panelists. In the interest of saving time, you will earlier have received a reminder email that have links to bios with the extensive accomplishments of our distinguished speakers. But quickly, Omar Khan is an assistant professor at the Institute of Biomedical Engineering and a leading expert in vaccines. He is a triple U of T chemical engineering grad, and his research combines engineering, biology, and chemistry fundamentals to create new nanotechnologies for better patient outcomes. He was also the scientific founder and chief scientist of Teva Biotech, a startup spun out of his MIT postdoc research that focused on the development of mRNA vaccines. Welcome, Omar. It's great to have you here. Ravinder Kumar is an assistant professor of chemistry and the director of the Center for Medicinal Chemistry at University of Toronto, Mississauga. Rav is also a global executive in the pharmaceuticals industry with experience as a senior leader at both GlaxoSmithKline and Apotex. Rav has a pharmacy degree and completed a PhD in novel drug delivery at the University of Bath in the United Kingdom. Welcome, Rav. Michael May is the Chief Executive Officer at the Center for Commercialization of Regenerative Medicine. At CCRM, Michael leads the way in developing new technologies and launching companies that catalyze investment in the field of regenerative medicine. Prior to CCRM, Michael was president and co-founder of Rymon Therapeutics, a Toronto-based tissue engineering company. Michael holds a BASc and a PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Toronto. Welcome, Michael. And last but not least, Chris Yip, who, as you know, is Dean of the Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering. And prior to that, he held the role of Associate Vice President in the university's International Partnerships Office. He is a leading scholar in single molecule biophysics and a faculty member with the Department of Chemical Engineering and Applied Chemistry, the Department of Biochemistry, and the Institute of Biomedical Engineering. Chris holds a BASc in chemical engineering from U of T and has his PhD in Chem Eng from the University of Minnesota. It's great to have you here, Chris, tonight as well on our panel. So let's jump right in. The theme of the panel, as we know, is the future of vaccine production, giving Canadian biomanufacturing a shot in the arm. Over the last 2 years, COVID-19 pandemic has certainly had a tremendous impact on nearly every aspect of our daily life, and it's affected literally almost every corner of the earth in some fashion or another. What lessons should the world be drawing about biomanufacturing, and which of these are especially relevant for Canada? Let me start with you, Chris.
Thanks, Claire. And that's a challenging question, I think, from the perspective of we're learning a lot about the complexity of how it is to do the scale up, the processes, understanding how you take a discovery, sort of the mRNA. And we've seen that sort of almost a long time. I'm going to let Omar sort of wax poetic on this a little bit, but the long timelines for the development, but then how quickly engineering can play a key role in the scale up once a particular therapy is being discovered. And I think we're also seeing in the context of COVID, how quickly these processes can be adapted to come up with new approaches in a much faster way than we've seen in the past. We've seen the key roles that in the biomanufacturing space that engineering plays, not just really on the manufacturing side, but also on the supply chain side of things. And we're seeing how everything is interrelated, the role that engineering plays across the globe. And this is, as we're seeing tonight in this discussion, the relevance for Canada in terms of our ability to respond, to have the appropriate technologies in place. And I think something that's super important from an engineering perspective, the talent that's required to be in this particular space and the need to grow that talent in the biomanufacturing and in the related sciences. So I'll end off there with my initial comments.
Great, thanks, Chris. Hold that thought on Talon because I want to come back to you later with a question on that. But let me go to Omar now, just to get your response to this question about what lessons the world could be drawing or should be drawing about biomanufacturing, and are there ones that are especially relevant for Canada? Omar.
Yeah, I think the most important lesson is distributed manufacturing. One of the challenges that we did see was, sorry, I have a 2-year-old. One of the problems we did see was when we had only a few plants being able to make vaccines, when they did simple things, normal routine things like needing to shut down a unit to clean it or to upgrade some piping or something like that, it shut down production everywhere. And people, like in places like Canada and everywhere in the world that were waiting in queue for vaccines, had their shipment delayed because naturally it took some time to ramp back up. So I think that's one of the big things. And the last thing is a lot of this stuff has been in development for nearly a decade. So from the perspective of normal people who are not developing it, it seemed new, but it actually wasn't. So this disconnect between what's normally happening in science versus what the public sees was something that was really revealed to us. And I think better communication about what we're doing would be great as well.
Great. I'm going to come back to you on that question for a bit of the backstory on mRNA vaccines. But Rob, let's go to you on this first question. Lessons the world should be drawing about biomanufacturing and any that are especially salient for Canada.
Sure. So, I mean, some of the points I make, I think will be very obvious, but certainly Canada and the world needs a secure and timely supply of pandemic vaccine. And not just vaccine, but obviously items related to that, like PPEs and ventilators and so on. And I think it was clear that Canada did not have an effective pandemic strategy and a vaccine supply plan that it could trigger when it needed to do it. And it was quickly evident that we could not rely on other countries to supply. And even friendly countries, were not prepared to supply, or there were issues. And with the geopolitics going on in the world at the moment, that's likely to become an even bigger factor in the future. On a positive note, I think Canada realized quickly and that this was an issue and negotiated with the vaccine manufacturers, the AstraZeneca's, Pfizer, Moderna's, to get in the queue. We probably paid high prices compared to what we could have paid had there been a plan in place at the outset. And of course, lessons for Canada, but we do need to worry about the world as well. And we need to make sure that the rest of the world, particularly poorer countries, are getting vaccine supply as well. Otherwise, we get into this, and we saw a bit of it, this vicious circle of new strains emerging from developing countries. So yeah, I think those for me are the key lessons learned.
Great, thanks. Michael, I want to come to you, and as president of the Center for Regenerative Medicine, you've got a broader lens on biomanufacturing than strictly vaccines and certainly COVID-19 vaccines. So help us understand what lessons, and maybe there's some broader ones to be understood in the broader biomanufacturing context that the world can learn and that are especially relevant for Canada.
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to highlight just how fast these vaccines were developed and were passed through regulations, not compromising it, but just the money put into it to address a real, critical issue that the world had to face. And that goes to collaboration, being able to dedicate resources and collaboration. And Canada always punches above its weight, and we always claim that it's around collaboration. So that's just a broad statement about kind of where Canada could fit in and be a leader. But the real lesson for Canada, I think, is threefold. First of all, we need to have a strategy for these issues, and the second is, as others have said, manufacturing advanced medicines is complex. It involves supply chain, it involves high technology, it involves many partners around the world. And so, there's a couple of lessons there. One, we can't create a strategy where we're planning on doing all of this alone, but we also can't have a strategy where we're just relying on others to contribute to a global a global strategy. And that means that we have to have something we're good at to contribute to those global partnerships. And we have to have good partners. And so these are elements of a strategy that are important. And the final thing, the third thing is, the future of vaccine manufacturing, I think, is thinking beyond vaccines. I mean, we've been in a crisis, a healthcare crisis. It happens to be a pandemic, but biomanufacturing goes beyond that. And many of us for the past several years have been thinking about biomanufacturing. And what this pandemic has shown is that a lot of the stuff we were talking about in terms of domestic supply and security and bringing university technology and industry together is something that we need to build a strategy around. But it goes to cell and gene therapy, biologics, monoclonal antibodies, and these new RNA and other technologies. That's going to be our manufacturing strategy in the future, and that'll make having a vaccine available to us, a domestic vaccine in the future as well.
Great, really interesting. Some threads that we can definitely draw on there. So plan beats no plan, and it's not just a question then of whether Canada should be a maker or a taker. In fact, what you're saying is that we need to be both. We need to be makers here, but we need to recognize that there's a broader supply chain context and in advanced biomanufacturing that we can play a role in, be a participant in. So a maker and a taker. But I want to come back to Omar, and great to see that we've got audience engagement right here on our panel. So that's fantastic. Welcome to perhaps our youngest audience member there. COVID-19 vaccines, were developed, I think, really with remarkable speed in some sense. But mRNA technology, the technology that underpins at least the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, had been under development for some time. So it was sort of an overnight sensation that was actually years in the making. So can you help us understand a little bit the backstory on mRNA vaccines? And then are there applications, beyond COVID-19 or even coronaviruses that are on the horizon for this technology? Help us understand that too.
Sure. So with mRNA, those vaccines were actually in clinical trial long before coronavirus vaccines were in clinical trial. So when mRNA came along, it was people learned how to manufacture it, and they learned how to manufacture it at scale to run clinical trials. So one of the earliest areas which they were looking at was HIV vaccines, seeing if they can help people. Very difficult thing to try to prevent or even treat, so it was an extremely high bar. So mRNA, in some senses, cut its teeth on doing one of the most hardest things you can possibly vaccinate against. There were also a lot of other vaccines like chikungunya. These are all kind of diseases that are prevalent in the developing world. So a lot of this work was being funded by nonprofit organizations around the world to try to provide people with better healthcare options, especially for diseases that people in developed worlds don't care about, to be honest. So that's where the nonprofits kind of came in to help out. So by the time we saw the pandemic for the coronavirus come out, a lot of these companies were able to pivot very quickly because they knew how to make these vaccines, but all they had to do was update the mRNA. Instead of producing an antigen that corresponded to HIV or chikungunya, what they could do instead is just express something like a spike protein, and in that way develop the vaccine. So there was a tremendous amount of work, at least a decade, that went behind that. And following the field, you would have kind of known that, but again, when it came to just the general public seeing all of a sudden mRNA vaccines manufactured so quickly and getting through to FDA approval, Health Canada approval, people were kind of shocked, saying, did this take too long? And in truth, a lot of that development happened many years ago. So that's kind of the first thing. And your second question was, sorry?
Was really about other applications. So I think you've touched on that already.
Yeah.
But if there are others, and we did have a question from the audience about Ebola, and you talked about vaccines for the developing world. Is there anything that you can kind of update us on or educate us on about the state of play in some of these other diseases and Ebola in particular?
Sure. So with Ebola, when Ebola came to America, and then there's a big impetus to try to figure out a way to overcome it, one of the important things that came out of that was ZMapp. It was a monoclonal antibody. Basically, they found a survivor and got a blood sample, found the antibodies that worked to neutralize Ebola, and then manufactured it. And then they gave that to people as a therapeutic. So that was something really interesting. But again, a therapeutic, meaning you treat someone after they've gone sick. In terms of a prophylactic vaccine, where you give someone the vaccine so they never get sick, that is still in development. And back at my time when I was at MIT, we were working with the US Army. We were also working on the development of a Ebola vaccine, but part of that was the need, right? And there wasn't this global push to need it. It was more of a developing world problem, so it's a sad thing, and it's something that we really need. But there are groups working on it, but without the level of resources that coronavirus had behind it, in terms of solving it, we just didn't have the resources to kind of push that through. But with that, places like Moderna, for example, are working on sort of crowdsourcing. So they're making available the mRNA they can build. So they were saying that we're going to go work with people who are experts in certain diseases. And if you have an idea of what mRNA could work in a vaccine, we can make that for you and we can test it. And then that way, maybe we can develop a new vaccine quite quickly. And in that case, engaging the community. And I think this is something that's new. We haven't seen this in the vaccine world before, simply because we have the ability to manufacture now. We can manufacture the parts really easily, and we can just update them and put them together. So there are a lot of things currently in play, ranging from Ebola all the way to the flu. So a lot of good things I think are coming. And then even beyond that, we're thinking about other things like people who have defective genes. So maybe something, for example, like a hereditary disease where they can't produce a certain protein in their body and they have to take a drug for the rest of their life. Perhaps they can have an mRNA that instructs the body to make that missing protein. And then you can live a better life that way. Another example is people who suffer from cystic fibrosis. They also have a defective gene. You can potentially use that to replace the defective gene. So lots of ways in which this can be.
Lots of applications.
Yes.
Yeah. And that notion of sort of open sourcing it is really interesting. I hadn't heard that before. So thank you for sharing that with us. I want to go to Rav now. Rav, you're the Director of Medicinal Chemistry at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and you're working to grow the ecosystem of life sciences in Canada. We talked a little bit about supply chain. So obviously top flight research is essential. But is it enough? And I'm going to hazard a guess that the answer to that question is no. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you, what more is needed for Canada to have really a thriving biomanufacturing industry?
Yeah, I think the one of the errors often made by governments and others is that government, you see it all the time. They react to things, and we do things not in a strategic way. And we saw some of that, the government, kind of chasing announcements and openings of facilities and so on. But I think some of what the government has done has actually been quite positive. So let me just come back to that in a moment. So I like to use the term ecosystem, and we're talking today about biomanufacturing, but biomanufacturing by itself won't be successful without that ecosystem around it of good education, good science, infrastructure, support for starting up new companies and so on and so forth. It's really important to have all of that holding it up. So if we look at biomanufacturing particularly, I think some really good moves have been made by the federal government and the provincial government of Ontario. So if I look at the biomanufacturing picture in this country, we've got Sanofi, the Sanofi operation in Toronto. We've got the GSK vaccines manufacturing operation in Quebec City, which have been around for decades, by the way. Contrary to what we heard from the government over the last couple of years that there's no vaccine manufacturing capability in Canada. So they've actually been around for a while, exporting pediatric and flu vaccines. Of course, you mentioned, Claire, the planned Moderna plant in Montreal. There's Novavax in Montreal. They'll be up and running soon. There's the upgrade of the resilience facility in Mississauga. And of course, Michael knows all about the Omnia Bio plan for Hamilton. That's a very substantial and excellent operation there as well. And in fact, the federal government announced last year, I think it was a $1.6 billion funding in 30 biomanufacturing/life sciences projects as part of the overall 2.2 billion something Canadian biomanufacturing and life sciences strategy. So this is really encouraging. And what I said earlier on about those announcements coming out, it's good because something has to kickstart it. And now it's about strategically working all of that stuff together and coordinating it. I've also been very pleased with what Ontario has done. And in fact, I was looking over the last few days at the Ontario plans, and that they also have a life sciences strategy, actually much more detailed than the federal government. It lays out different phases. It talks about success factors and things that indicate success. So I think that's a much more detailed plan that they put into place. A life sciences council as well that will really work with them closely. And so my final point here is that I think we've got some nice emerging infrastructure, and it'll be really important for the government and others, experts, to think about what might the next pandemic look like, because something's coming for sure. It won't be the same as we have now. And how will those organizations work together? What roles will each of them play so that we can trigger a response quickly? And so just to me, it's excellent that these plans are in place or these strategies are in place, and it's all about execution now.
Right. I agree, Rob, that it's important to give credit where credit is due, and I thank you for pointing out some things that I bet others in the audience didn't know were already underway in Canada. But lest we sound sort of too optimistic or happy about the state of affairs, Michael, I want to come to you and ask you about challenges for Canada. And do we have the right policies? Do we need policy changes or other changes? Help us understand the landscape in terms of barriers really to commercialization at scale. What do we need to do better or differently here?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, Canada has always focused on doing great R&D and being great innovators, but we don't have a large market in Canada. So, we have to, diffuse our great ideas out into the broader market. And it means that critical investments are not as easy to make in Canada. So access to capital, investing in infrastructure, because we don't have a market to support it here. So we have to be creative about how we play in the overall kind of global ecosystem, so that we always have something to trade. So if we have a crisis and we do something well, then it may not be a vaccine, but it's part of the supply chain or technology. And I just want to remind everyone, the mRNA vaccines were largely enabled by Canadian innovation of being able to deliver RNA into the body through lipid nanoparticles. I mean, so Canada played a role in enabling those vaccines and contributed to that. But, manufacturing is like, we have to change our paradigm here. It's not just about, building a building somewhere in Brampton, 4 walls, inviting investment there and building a plant and saying we have capacity. We're gonna make things here. For something like biomanufacturing, we have to tie to it ecosystem and think about this from an ecosystem perspective, which Rav already said. And that's so that, what we do in Canada is kind of sticky in Canada and creates kind of wealth. And I don't think we need to be we need to transition from defense, which the COVID, we've had to do it with the COVID pandemic. But we need to think about a strategy from the offense perspective. What's the crisis in the future? Maybe, but what are also the products that we can develop in Canada and sell around the world to, treat, diseases, chronic diseases and other things, not just pandemics. So when we think about this ecosystem, we need to think about manufacturing as an ecosystem. So it's not just about a plant, it's about the supply chain. It's about, all the services associated with it. It's about technologies that come out of academia, for example, that drive that. And then we have to think about that manufacturing ecosystem in the broader context of a commercialization ecosystem. So as opposed to just inventing things in a small market and then that IP being easily diffused around the world, we need to create receptor capacity in Canada. So how are we doing clinical trials in Canada? How are we manufacturing those products in Canada? How are we having investment come from Canada to get a return on the investment? How are we changing our healthcare so that our innovations in healthcare are delivered in Canada, kind of best in class delivery that then can be taught around the world for economic development for us as well? So how do we create this ecosystem, this commercialization ecosystem on the back of a manufacturing ecosystem to make certain that things stay in Canada and the benefits stay in Canada and our population has access to these? And I think, three critical factors, just very, very high level. Manufacturing. If we're masters of manufacturing, the companies we create in Canada, those innovative little companies that grow to big companies, they'll stay in Canada. If we invest more in Canada and access to capital is enabled, they don't have to go elsewhere in the world to get money. Companies will stay in Canada and the innovations will stay in Canada and the commercialization will be here. And the third is talent. All great ideas come from people. And we need to make certain that talent stays in Canada. And if you create that stickiness, you'll build ecosystem, and we won't need to worry about reacting like we have in the COVID pandemic.
Great perspectives. Thanks. Thank you for that. Chris, I want to kind of circle back to the proverbial lab and talk about, have you talked to us about novel developments or innovations, things you're really excited about? And we have had a question from the audience about the role of AI. Is there a role for AI? Are there AI applications? So perhaps you can weave that in, and I'm happy to go to Omar on that question if he's got some perspectives on that. So help us understand what's sort of new and exciting and innovative at U of T, and if you can comment on AI, that would be great. And perhaps Omar, I can come to you on that AI question as well. Sure. But let's start with you, Chris.
Sure. So first off, I just want to there's a bioengineering really it's all about the history of research at that interface, right, between biology and engineering, and not only the human health domain, but just across a whole bunch of different spheres. And I think what's really exciting and what's kind of novel is really getting opportunities for, Mike just mentioned talent, right? Whether that's students and faculty working at that interface. And it's talking about sort of the basic science discoveries, Omar sort of talked about mRNA strategies, but how you are enabling those and scaling those up by integrating engineering now into that, right? And looking at those different tools. And you start thinking about all the high throughput strategies. And as Omar was talking, I started thinking about, and as Mike was mentioning as well, sort of homegrown Canadian strategies, not just U of T, but Peter Cullis's work at UBC around lipid nanoparticles, which goes back, I think, to actually when I started as a faculty member like 20 years ago, looking at how does the lipids encapsulate things and how do you use them to transport. The work that Carl Hansen did with his AbCellera platform and high throughput strategies to look at antibodies and screen them using single cell strategies. These are all things which were, you could conceive of doing them, but you needed engineering to come into play and build these high throughput, these strategies for doing this in microfluidic platforms, parallel strategies, things which generate inordinate amounts of data, which at the time would have been things which would be really difficult for us to analyze without machine learning, artificial intelligence technologies, which are now developing in parallel. And you're now giving them the data sets to start to work with, right? You're starting to look at sequencing data. You're starting to be able to do these things in a much faster strategy. And not only people that sort of, identify new drug targets, understand what was going on, especially early on in this process. I'll sort of look at a couple of exciting things within engineering, at least within U of T, and sort of look at what people are doing in terms of organ on chip technologies to try and understand how disease is propagating in the context of COVID. Like how can we screen different drugs? The work that Melissa Radicic has done in her lab in chip technologies and building tissues on chip to look at the effect of drugs or look at the effect of the virus on function and trying to use that as a screening tool. We've seen, probably more than we want, the value of rapid tests and how do those work. But we've also seen the challenges built into those, right? As the variants change, then are the tests as accurate? And what's changing? How do you improve on those? And you start to look at other technologies, which people like in biomedical engineering are looking at different strategies to build more sensitive approaches that could be better at detecting variations along these, right? So these are things that are happening now at this interface. I think we're looking at engineering tools, both coming in terms of helping to do the initial analysis, but also the scale up and giving students that opportunity is really what's a key part of the talent pipeline. The AI side, I think we've seen how quickly we can go through and identify these, the spike protein, the variations in the genetic profiles, all this kind of information. We can do so much faster now than we were able to do 10 or 15 years ago because of what has happened in kind of the computer science space. So I'll leave my comments there. Omar, you may have more comments on the AI side, the machine learning side, and its value.
Yeah, just let me go to Omar with that, and then Chris, I just want to come back to you to have you expand a little bit about that lab on a chip. So help us as audience members who, myself as a layperson, understand what that application really means. Is it going to speed up clinical trials? Is it going to, make it easier to separate the wheat from the chaff, if I can call it that, sort of earlier in the drug discovery kind of process? So I want to come back to you, and I would actually commend the Rotman's latest magazine. It's got a piece actually on biomanufacturing, and it speaks about some of the interesting things that are going on. So I'll just do a shout out to Rotman on that. So I'm going to come back to you on Lab on a Chip, but let me go to Omar with a question about AI, machine learning, data science, and the applications that has in vaccine development or biomanufacturing more generally.
I think maybe the most accessible answer I can give is kind of tell you two problems and how AI can help those. So the first is, as Chris mentioned, figuring out what is the right antigen that will be protective against a certain disease. So a lot of that comes into, can you have this antigen, which is a unique protein found for a pathogen that's found nowhere else in your body. If you want to show that to the immune system and say, whenever you see this, destroy anything connected to it because that's bad, it's important to find the right one. So of those things, AI can be really useful in looking at past data that we've collected through normal science and normal clinical applications and say what worked. And of those things that worked, what was all common and what didn't work and why, and then kind of feed that in and try to develop an understanding through this artificial intelligence method to figure out, now, can we take this forward and predict? If someone says a novel coronavirus is now here again, or maybe it's MERS virus, something else, and based on that, look at the entire genome of that pathogen and say, from our experience, we've been able to see that these unique proteins or antigens are the ones that are probably going to be protective in humans. Let's make those. So that's a great way in which AI can interface. The second is on the delivery side. You have a great mRNA, but then you have to get it inside the body so that the body's cells can read it and follow the instructions, make the antigen to show it to the immune system. So with that, on that side, we can look at the chemical space. What are the chemical structures, for example, that made a great nanoparticle that was able to very efficiently deliver this mRNA so that your immune system can use that instruction set to build immunity? And that's another way you can do that, because there's a lot of factors you can look at. You can look at how quickly it releases once it's inside the cell, how quickly it can, does it enter the cell very quickly or does it enter slowly, the kinetics of that. So these are all things that you can go back and look, all that past data, build kind of an understanding through, your AI framework, and then from there apply it to the future. So those are kind of great ways in which we can make that work.
So it's really that question is sort of pattern recognition, if at some kind of fundamental level, and understanding what works and what doesn't work. Maybe a bit more sophisticated than identifying every cat in this in this array of photos, but at some level it's a kind of a pattern recognition exercise, and just the volume of data that can be collected and would have to be crunched is beyond what can be done in a timely way at a human scale. So AI, machine learning, and data science more broadly is going to unlock some real advances. Thank you for that, Chris. Let me come back to you then for that question on lab on a chip, and just elaborate a little bit for us on that.
Yeah. So just, I guess, for the audience, and a bit of probably a very high level description, a lab on a chip would really be in this context was sort of how do I make a model tissue, say a blood vessel, vasculature, or cardiac tissue that I can probe and test, but sort of outside of the body, but on a fluidic device. So it basically emulates what's happening in the body. And I could build multiples of these devices, and I could screen what happens or understand what happens when it starts to interact with the virus, or in this case, what gets triggered when that tissue is exposed to certain proteins which are maybe stimulated by the immune system because of the effect of the virus. And so the advantage of these devices, it's an artificial structure, right? It's sort of a mimic. But the idea is that you could use these as strategies to rapidly identify what's going on, trying to understand what's happening, and then use it as a way of trying to put something back into the system, try and repair that or reduce the effect, in this case, of inflammation. And this is the context, again, of what Melitza's group has been working on this the sort of cardiovascular structure. What's known is that there's this, depending on the individual, the immune system can go into hyperdrive. And that's a bad thing to have happen. And this causes inflammation or severe inflammation, and in particular, cardiac effects. And so trying to understand how that happens, and what you can do to introduce a drug or an anti-inflammatory that can reduce this effect, but looking at it on a kind of a model tissue as a way of rapidly screening it and doing it outside of the body. So you're not using an animal model, you're just a physical construct of it. And there's a significant amount of work in using these model structures, model organoids, as a way of doing this in kind of a high throughput strategy, which then starts to introduce, back to Laura's point, more data that gets generated because you've got these systems and you can rapidly test them, see what's happening, and then go back and look for more detailed insights.
Great, cool. I'll go to, let me Michael then on lab on a chip, and I'll come to Omar, and then we're going to go to a question just about the global context. So Michael and then Omar.
Yeah, I just wanted to stress what Chris said earlier about this convergence of kind of engineering and biology. And if there are students, participating today, I think that's at that interface is, really exciting. When I graduated 25 years ago, I was doing my PhD. The advice was you're going to have to go somewhere else to take advantage of your training in at that interface, but that's not the case in Canada anymore. And biomanufacturing is about, creating products that are living. Sometimes the product comes from the cells, and in my area, the cells themselves are the product. And when you're manufacturing things that are living or are living through part of the process, it's very, very challenging. And even in the last 10 years, in my field, we've gone from a stage where we can actually create from a sample of blood stem cells from a patient, and we can then differentiate or modify those cells so that they can become any tissue in the body. And now with the gene editing tools out there in the last 10 years, we can take those cells and we can genetically modify them to manufacture them easier, to make them avoid the immune system, to have them function better. So there's this wonderful control of the biology to create these super cells. And now, at my organization, we're scaling those biological processes to where we can do clinical trials safely and create product, consistent product at scale. And then all of these investments that Rav talked about, including ours, is about taking it to the commercial scale. But it's all about taking that biology and the amazing tools we have to manipulate that biology, whether it's vaccine manufacturing or cell or whatever, these advanced therapies, and scaling it robustly for future therapeutics. That's at the that's the heart of biomanufacturing, and it's a pretty amazing place to be in science right now.
Cool. Omar, let me go to you on you wanted to comment on Lab on a Chip.
Sure. I think one of the challenges with wanting to make sure that we're ready for anything in the future is that it's somewhat we have great talent and capacity to do things, but having those industries in place already can be seen by some as speculative, because you say that maybe this is the next technology, this is the next big thing, and then we have to build this, and then at that point, does Canada have enough what we call risk capital to fund the creation of all these different things so that we can have everything on hand ready for us? So that's one of the big differences between us and other places like America. But I think it's something that, as Mike and Rav were mentioning, we're starting to overcome that. But to get back to Lab on a Chip, to kind of ground this in what's happening in the pandemic, as engineers, we kind of link tech with fundamental science, try to put it all together, make things easier. So we look at pain points. Now, in the manufacturing space for making vaccines, one of the most challenging things is what is called a potency assay. So you make your vaccine or your product, and then you have to show that it works before it's ready to go on the shelf somewhere or go to the clinic somewhere. You have to show it works, and that's called a potency assay. So we've been struggling for decades with the same type of potency assay. You test it in an animal, and that takes a long time. So something like Lab on a Chip is great, because people weren't necessarily looking at that for a potency assay where you can say, hey, why don't we just test these vaccines on this miniaturized version of a kind of human in this Lab on a Chip and see if it's stimulating this protoform immune system and making sure that it works. And so if we can deploy something like a Lab on a Chip in the context of a potency assay, we can save weeks and get stuff out sooner. Because remember, a lot of these manufacturing companies were churning out a ton of vaccines, but they can't lot release them. They can't release the lots until they've gone through all these tests, like, is it sterile, does it have enough potency, all these things. And that's one of the biggest bottlenecks that we had. And that slows things down, because when you don't have vaccines going out to people, they're getting infected, they're spreading it, viral replication events, evolution, mutations, all sorts of things. So that's an example of how we can be tactical by looking at what we have available and then deploying it in a really clever way to get us past these old bottlenecks that they've been around for 80 years, and we can solve it pretty quickly.
Yeah, sort of coming back to that point that we were even opening with about the importance of supply chain, and you're identifying something really practical there. Ralph, I want to come to you. I think we've just had something has fallen in front of your camera, so we're just getting a bit of
I'm sorry. Okay, there.
On your camera there. So we've talked a little about the global context. Canada needing to be both a maker and a taker. It sounds like we need international cooperation, but isn't there inherently competition here? So talk to us a little bit about that global context and where Canada is ranking, and if you see that there are sort of particular strengths that Canada has. And conversely, if there are areas where it's just not going to be cost effective for us to develop some element of the supply chain on a cost-effective way, and we're going to need to go to another market or another source for that. Rob, talk to us about that.
Sure. So I'd say as a starting point, that Canada has what you might call a decent foundation in terms of vaccine production, and I talked earlier on about the Sanofi operation and the operation that the GSK has. The Sanofi one in particular is a large operation, and I believe there's an additional $1 billion investment that's going into that over the next few years, and currently supplying globally. So I think this is just as an additional point. I think what Michael kind of talked about commercialization earlier. So I think that operation is proof that if you set up a good operation you can be successful in terms of commercially supplying the world. And I think that's I think that investment, I think, was Sanofi's largest investment globally made in any vaccine plant. So I think a reasonable foundation, and then operations scattered around the country. I talked earlier on about some of the investments that have been made by the government. I talked also earlier about the fact that some of them were reactive. Government wanted to make announcements. We all heard stories of the federals having an announcement ready and lined up, and then the province wanted to jump on it because everyone wanted to announce something to say that we're doing something about this very, very serious issue in front of us. So I'd say that it's a reasonable place to begin. Those investments have begun. We've got bits and pieces of that ecosystem that Michael and I have referred to. And I think the key now is going to be to ensure that this is not forgotten. The pandemic has allowed the government to really focus on this issue. Those of us in the life sciences community have been talking and shouting for years and years that there needs to be a life sciences strategy in Canada, and the government really hasn't pulled it together. So it took the pandemic to do that. There is a making of it now, and as I said before, it's easy to come up with a strategic plan, and the plan. The difficulty is in the execution and making sure that it happens, particularly as other waves of other future challenges and issues come, and we have to make sure that this doesn't get put on the back burner at some point in the future. In terms of where Canada stands globally, I think it was pretty self-evident that Canada was not able to manufacture its own pandemic vaccines, and we had to rely on other markets to do that, whereas the likes of countries, India, China, Russia, were able to manufacture vaccines and were indeed able to export vaccines. On the point around competition versus cooperation, I think by its very nature of the very large investments that are needed to get these biological and vaccine plants up and running, and the very long timelines that are needed for its years, for the product development and manufacturing processes, it by that very nature, it has to be competitive. However, when things like pandemics hit, it has to switch to cooperation, particularly within Canada. And I think that's part of what I talked to earlier on as well, which is that, with all these investments and all these facilities, operational, these are bets that have been placed by the government. The strongest bet is probably the Moderna one, because that plant was almost certainly will be almost entirely funded by the government, and the government will tell Moderna what it wants out of it when the time approaches. But with all the other sort of operations that are being established around the country, we must have a plan for cooperation and know what those organizations and groups will do when the next pandemic comes.
Great. Omar, maybe I can come to you on this question. And if you want to highlight for us any, kind of particular partnerships that U of T is involved in with other universities, or just talk to us a little bit about this international context in Situate Canada.
Well, in terms of Canada's involvement, for example, in this coronavirus pandemic, a lot of the fundamental delivery technologies, like Chris was mentioning, came from places like UBC. And so the Pilar Quiles group did all the pioneering work for the delivery of mRNA. So that became the fundamental part of it. And in fact, even now, they are continuing to be the kind of delivery system for a lot of the next kind of mRNA products that are coming out. Other types of vaccines and other manufacturers are doing generation 2 versions of their current vaccines with some of that fundamentally Canadian technology. So that's fantastic. And going back to the example of the mRNA Access Program for Moderna, a lot of universities across Canada have signed up to be part of that program where once again, they have at each university experts in certain disease areas. And then they can be able to say that, hey, this is what we think are great antigens. What do you think, Moderna? Do you want to go in on this? And then they're like, sure, we'll make mRNA at cost for you because we have these giant plants now that could do GMP stuff and we're ready to go. And then co-develop something. And then hopefully, if it's useful, that could be another product to help people. So those are kind of things. And it's kind of, that's an example. And actively, many universities across Canada are always in negotiations, talks, and eventually partnerships with pharmaceutical companies who are interested in the fundamental science that places are doing. So even at U of T, right, places like Merck and Pfizer and Sanofi all have what are called strategic research agreements, where they're looking at, this is great technology that's coming out of the university. Can this be turned into something that can help patients? And that's great because not only does it leverage the smarts and talents that Canadians have, but then Canadians can leverage that big manufacturing partner's ability to put this stuff together and then help get it across the world. So it's a great kind of partnership. And while we work towards, building our own capacity to do that sort of thing, this is especially important because when we think about what we have to deal with, if we do have a global manufacturing hub here in Canada, right? And if you have contracts that have come in and you have to fulfill those contracts, that doesn't necessarily mean Canada can always be at the start of the line. So we saw this in India. They were making AstraZeneca vaccines and they had to export them. They couldn't necessarily go to the population. And this is part of the challenge with being a service provider essentially for some other company, or having something homegrown here that we can rely on. So I would argue we need both because we do want to contribute to the global solution. So we want to get stuff out there, but then we also want to make sure Canadians are protected as well. So I think a mix of both is definitely a great way to go. But I think Canadians are very modest, and we don't hear many examples of, university researchers making great connections with companies and moving things towards the clinic. And I think that modesty is fine, but I think maybe we have to take cues from other places in the world where people are very proud of what they do, and that kind of being that vocal can also help attract more things in a good way. So I think it's great to show what we can do.
Great. We need to inoculate ourselves against the great Canadian humble brag. That'll be a challenge for biomanufacturing. We've touched on talent, and we've got a question from the audience on this, noting that Pfizer and Moderna have said that their biggest challenge is talent pipeline. And so, we don't yet have a reactor in which to grow talent. We have to attract, train, and retain workers with those in-demand skills. So I want to come to you, Michael and Chris, to talk about talent and what are some of the solutions there. And then just to tee it up, to give you a heads up, we've had a couple of questions also on access to capital. So I want to go to Omar and to Michael, who've both been leaders of spin-out companies, early stage companies. I'm going to come back and ask you about access to capital, but let me go to Chris and Michael on talent. Chris, you first.
Sure. Thanks. And it's a great question. I was actually going to say we actually do have a bioreactor. It's called Undergrad University. It's got a 4-year growth cycle, or 5-year if you do PY, and boom, they're out. It's Michael and I have had this conversation, I think, going back a decade or longer, about the importance of getting students interested in this particular space. Manufacturing has long been something Canada is great at. Biomanufacturing is now this interface. It's a complicated field, and one which requires students to have this diverse understanding. And I think we have been building this. And I started to look at, students who have gone out now. So like the manager of engineering at Resilience is an undergraduate at his 4th-year thesis in Chem-Eng in my lab, 10 years ago, and is now in that particular role. We've seen students go to Sanofi. We've seen them roll into these positions. And I think for us, it's about how do we bring those sorts of courses and those opportunities at the undergraduate level, right? So you're introducing students into that. You're giving them PUI positions, internships in those particular opportunities. So they see the value, they see how they're working. And I want to emphasize, this is like, I'm a chem eng, Mike's a chem eng, Omar's a chem eng. So we've kind of got a stacked field, but this is an area which actually brings in all of our disciplines, right? And we're starting to see this now. You've got the EC, you've got mechanical engineers, you've got supply chain people, you've got them all into this particular space because it's an all-encompassing, it's one which requires input from all those different domains. So we're seeing the opportunity to do that. One of the things that I think that's going to help build the talent that is needed, and this came up almost immediately when someone said, we're going to build a factory. It's like, okay, well, you need 500 people. It's like, that's like the entire population of all the universities graduating tomorrow. And it's like, that's not there. We've got to build the programs, build the lab experiences. Rav and I have had conversations about how do we build a model GMP type facility to train students on these tools as they roll forward. And so that's at the undergrad level. I think the other one about attracting, retaining, and also upskilling is what universities can do in terms of taking people who are 2 or 3 years out and want to come back and know about these new technologies and doing that. So we've actually in engineering, one of the recent micro-credential courses, it's around R&D and biomanufacturing, is now being rolled out through chemical engineering as a way of providing that upskilling opportunity for those who have already graduated and want to get into the field now. So it's all about providing that continuum of opportunities. I want to end off before I turn it back to Mike. One of the things that I think Omar hinted at earlier is that we're talking about the manufacturing, which is translating it out, but there's all this long, it's not the tail because that's the wrong side. It's actually the front end of growing all this. It's really investment that needs to be made in the basic sciences and supporting that basic discovery research to drive this before you get the companies that come in and start to go along with this. And that's something which is important from the faculty members' perspective. It's giving those students the opportunity to kind of get in the basic research side and the lab opportunities that go to the startups, which then grow this all along. So it's a continuum of investment that needs to be made by the government in these particular opportunities to build talent across the different spheres. So I don't know, Mike, is that kind of lines up with what you were thinking?
Yeah, it's exactly. And I won't be repetitive, but the our manufacturing facility has doubled in size in 7 months, and so we know how critical this talent gap is in biomanufacturing. And and one of the things we've done in the last 4 or 5 months is with some of our nonprofit partners is thought about a training institute or a training consortium to work with universities, colleges, and industry to tackle this gap, which is a global gap. And if Canada needs to figure it out, particularly with all the investments happening here. But there is some sort of, when you think about biomanufacturing and training in biomanufacturing, what will differentiate us is having specialized infrastructure to teach those students or to upskill other, manufacturing personnel to do biomanufacturing. You need to have, mock suites, specialized facilities, and they're very expensive. And the best way to do that is to share and collaborate. So there needs to be a way to create these, centers, have universities working with industry, with specialized training institutes, and organizations like ours to really tackle this problem. It's unique. We all have done variations of it in the past, but it has to be part of the strategy, because any biomanufacturing strategy in Canada falls apart without the talent. And we're directly competing with the rest of the world on this. Everyone is suffering from that. If we figure it out, we will be ahead.
Yeah, some great points, and that war on talent seems to be sort of particularly acute in this area. And as you say, Michael, it really is a global market for this kind of expertise. So something that policymakers need to be thinking about. So let's come back to access to capital. We talked a little bit about human capital. Let's talk about sense capital. And you often hear in Canada, lamentations about the fact that we don't have enough venture funding, and and so on and so forth. So tell us, your personal experience as founders, as leaders in companies that have spun out of universities with advanced technology. What has your experience been like about access to capital? And maybe we can do a bit of a compare and contrast between Canada and the U.S. if you're able to comment on that, Omar, based on your experience at MIT. But why don't we start with Michael, and then I'm going to go to Omar.
Yeah, so just very tangible kind of data at the high level. So, my organization is really at the heart of it is company creation in this cell and gene therapy space. And I told you generally the strategy of if we're masters of the manufacturing, if we can, catalyze investment and develop talent, we think that companies will stay in Canada, because that's really been the challenge for 40, 50 years in life sciences is you get successful technology, a company goes down to Boston where there's capital there and all the parts of the ecosystem. So how do you create a strategy to create stickiness? And in 2016, and we've helped launch a number of companies, but in 2016, we launched a company and we didn't have our manufacturing infrastructure in place, no domestic investment for that company, which is very common, and no training in place. And 95% of the employees in that company are based outside of Canada. In 2018, we also helped launch a company, but had our manufacturing capabilities in place, or at least some of it, not the commercial scale, no domestic investment, but about 50% of the employees are in Canada. We then launched a company in 2020 where we were investors in that company. There was domestic investment in that company. A lot of manufacturing infrastructure in place, and starting the training aspect, and about 90% of the employees of that company are in Canada. So there's a trend there, and so but my experience of 25 years as an entrepreneur is that most of the pathway in life sciences towards financing was outside of Canada. I mean, there are very committed and dedicated VCs in Canada, but we don't have a robust, venture capital space. We don't have enough money. And so we have to get the government to support and kind of unlock capital. We also have to Canada's a rich country. There's, there are big pension funds. There's lots of profits being made in other sectors. We have to come up with a strategy where public-private partnerships are unlocking more domestic capital investment and taking that risk because, as I hope my example showed, if you start to put those pieces together, you create stickiness. And that's really what, all of our aim is in creating industry in Canada.
Great. Thanks for those personal reflections, Michael. Over to you, Omar.
So I started mine in the Boston area, so it was a bit different. What I ended up finding is that it was much easier to get follow-on investment from Canada and not initial investment. So after someone kind of went through it and say, I'll take the bet on this, I think this is a good idea, and do it, and then you get some bit of momentum. And then the follow-on investment came. So we got follow-on investment from the government of Canada, and it was excellent, and it really helped us kind of move things. And then we got out to places like South Africa, and then we got to do a lot of great things. So that I find was, to Michael's point, that there is money here, at least on the public money and the federal government side, that can help. And in my experience, it was follow-on investment. But again, to Michael's point, we are a rich country, and a lot of this seed investment that people in my cohort from the Langer Lab who all started up companies, a lot of their initial funding did come from, for example, wealthy family funds and that sort of thing. So these are people who are interested in science, they have a lot of extra cash, and they want to do something interesting with it. And having access to that, just places like Boston and San Francisco are great hubs for that, because people went there, and New York, to kind of connect with people and do good things. And so that's a great way to get things seeded. And I think having something similar in here, not just access to public funds, but also maybe finding a way to have people excited about what's here, because I was still Canadian, my co-founder was still Canadian, and all my friends were Canadian, and we were just physically not in Canada at the time. So the same work would have gotten done up here, but we just needed that seed to get started. So I think, it's not just policy, but it's also kind of changing the culture to think that, we have talent here, they're just going to do it somewhere else, and hopefully they come back. And I think that's also perhaps part of the solution to this talent trend, because we have, of the people who can do all this stuff, many of them are Canadian, they're just not here. So if they have the reason, like I did, to come back and do it here, that's going to be fantastic. So we can actually have a leg up, and an unfair advantage in that case, because we have well-trained Canadians. We have people who are working in manufacturing right now, big global companies, and maybe they're like me, they miss Canadian healthcare and poutine, the two reasons I came back. So like, I always got sick of people putting mozzarella on fries and saying it's poutine. That's kind of not right. So these are important things, and I think, what do we have to do to help people see Canada as attractive and a future for their careers? And I think it's just a way to embrace them, not just on a public policy side, which can be slow, but also on a personal individual side, where we can get all of our these funds and family wealth funds and anything else like that, any kind of angel investors excited about our talent, and hopefully that can come together. So again, I think, but also it's an interesting way to kind of do it, because I think what, for example, the provincial government has done is that they've offered a lot of tax credits to a company that has R&D here in Canada. So what a lot of places do is that they start companies in America and set up Canadian divisions, and then where they have their in-house Canadian R&D, and then they get all these tax credits to kind of attract more R&D and development here. So that's kind of another strategy to, and again, it's working with the system that's kind of there and kind of, leveraging it towards us, or we say, okay, why don't we attract that talent pool back here somehow and have these other Canadian divisions here while we work on making our own things, So that's kind of my perspective.
Yeah, there's a lot of different, I think, sort of policy threads there. And I think that this is something that that we hear often in Canada, is that there's just not enough sort of risk capital. At the one end, we've got government that it does a pretty good job, I think, of funding R&D, although they could obviously put more money into Canada's best university, U of T. So I will say that. But at the same time, maybe we've got in some sense, a public that is both too demanding and in some sense not demanding enough. So we don't really know kind of where things are at, and yet we sort of jump on government if there are failures. And one of our audience members has sort of pointed this out about the political environment, and politicians obviously operate in that sphere, and they're going to be responsive to incentives. So they like to be making announcements, like was made recently in Quebec, etc. At the same time, I saw a headline not that long ago in the Globe that kind of made my heart sink, which was the government was being criticized for having spent $20 million on a COVID rapid test that turned out not to have worked. Well, if it turned out that it had worked, then, they would have been geniuses. But I think we have to accept that there's a certain amount of failure. Now, that's not to say that, money should be wasted or should be spent willy-nilly. But if we are going to have, standby capacity, for example, in vaccine or other biomanufacturing, if we are going to, really want to incent early stage enterprises, we are going to pay for that, in some cases through failure, in some cases, through this standby capacity or excess capacity or redundancy in the system. And so I think it's a question of, kind of making smart choices, which aren't always going to be winners, with the benefit with the benefit of hindsight. So a lot there, and I appreciate that perspective from the audience member on that. So, I mean, you've talked about, Boston and that whole area around Cambridge, Massachusetts being, certainly a global hub for life sciences. You see the big pharma manufacturers in Switzerland, in the UK, and other places in the US. But Toronto has a story to tell, and U of T at the heart of TASN, which is the Toronto area hospital network that U of T sits at the center of. So I'm going to put Chris on the spot here and just talk to us a little bit about, and maybe it's about maybe a little bit about IBBME, but can you talk to us just about that sort of life sciences, health sciences ecosystem, frankly clustered around U of T and our hospital network in Toronto? And I'll just get you to come off mute there.
This is what I think really sets U of T apart. I've made this argument. I mean, Omar may correct me, maybe Michael will correct me, but I'd like to say that we probably have the largest health sciences research complex in North America. If you add all the hospitals and U of T together as one giant enterprise, which is highly collaborative. And I think what's intriguing about U of T, it has a long-standing history, obviously, around discovery. If you go all the way back to insulin and its scale out and what it gave in terms of an example of discovery research, rolling out to translation, rolling out to immediate impact in the world. And then you can sort of comment about the commercial side of that as well. But I think what we've got is this really unique environment that is geographically just so concentrated, right? You've got engineering, you've got medicine, you've got the discovery district, you've got the hospitals all in 5 minutes of each other. And you've got researchers, and you mentioned IBME now, we lost one of the B's for biomedical engineering, that has faculty which sit within engineering, within medicine, that are based at the hospital research institutes, which all are fully collaborating around all these different challenges. And I think that's what's a really remarkable ecosystem. And CCRM that Michael leads, emerged directly out of chemical engineering, which had leadership coming from biomedical engineering, which rolled through, which was, you could argue, was the foundation of kind of Mars. It just built out from that about translating these researchers. And we've seen how Mike's efforts have led to what is really a remarkable success story for Canada in terms of this initial investment and what it's become over the past 10, 15, well, you might have said 25 years, but I don't want to date you, but it's been such an enormous success. And how much homegrown talent is actually sitting inside there, right? The number of chemical engineers and biomedical engineers, other engineers come from U of T who rolled through CCRM and actually now gone into other enterprises that have spun out from that. So it should put a family tree.
Chris, it's about 600 individuals that have gone on to be leaders beyond that. But Chris, don't forget that outside of that downtown core, there's the heartland, like there's a heartland of manufacturing in Ontario. And right next door to the Discovery District is kind of Canada's financial district. Sure. So when we talk about bringing money to bear and manufacturing to bear and discovery and science and clinical, capacity and capabilities, it's all in the Toronto region and in Southern Ontario more broadly. So we, and in the last 25 years that I've been involved in the ecosystem, it has changed and evolved immensely. So the trajectory is all in the right direction. And we don't talk about brain drain anymore. We are attracting people into the ecosystem from everywhere. So that all the trajectory is in the right direction. It really is a global, North American, and a global hub in the space. So,
yeah, that's really positive to hear. And just coming back on the investment, and Omar, you were right to raise family offices. And we would be remiss if we did not call out the Temerty family, who have been extraordinary donors to U of T with a $250 million gift, naming the Faculty of Medicine and making substantial investments in medicine and in life sciences at U of T. So it's fantastic to see pioneers and leaders right here at home in Canada. As we are coming to the top of the hour, I want to thank our audience for all your engagement. We've had some great questions. I think they've really, really enriched the conversation. And I want to go to our, essentially sort of closing question. And I'm going to give each of our panelists just a couple of minutes to reflect on a takeaway that you would like our audience to have about biomanufacturing. Maybe it's about, what's just over the horizon. Maybe it's to reiterate some of the, key themes or, policy issues that we have touched on. So perhaps I'm going to start with Michael, and then I'll go to Omar, and I'll go to Rav, and then I'm going to wrap up with Chris. So Michael, back to you.
Yeah, so look, the COVID pandemic and our focus on vaccine manufacturing over the past several years has been around, a global tragedy. But it has put the microscope on an opportunity for Canada, problems in Canada, but also an opportunity in Canada that goes well beyond vaccine manufacturing. Biomanufacturing in general is an opportunity for Canada to be to take its place and a leadership position in life sciences globally around areas of excellence in Canada. So, I would just rally behind let's think about offense here and transition from defense. And I think that's where we're going to leverage the most out of, obviously what has been a tragedy.
Yeah, as the Stanley Cup playoffs get underway, that's a perfect comment. Let's hope the Leafs do enough of offense and defense to finally break the curse of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Not that I'm actually a sports watcher. Let me come to Omar then with sort of a key kind of takeaway message, thought, perspective that you want our audience to have.
Sure, I think if we look at the pandemic, one of the reasons in which vaccines could be made on a global scale so quickly is that places like BioNTech connected with places like Pfizer to have a unified effort, Moderna, that they plugged into places all over the world. All of these companies did something in common. They partnered with places in other countries to help manufacture subcomponents or other parts. And whether that was in Switzerland or in Germany or in America or France, these things happened. And I think Canada had similar capacities. So I think if we need to showcase that a bit more, one of the ways we can showcase that is to show that we are vibrant in the startup area and that we have this capacity and we have this talent and we have to we know we have this, but we need to be recognized globally for this. And I think that's how the first baby step to kind of plug us into this, because we do have that capacity. And then from there, maybe rethink of this. Everything we do doesn't have to work. I think once we accept that risk that everywhere else in the world has accepted, then we can get past this and realize that, sometimes a failure is still a tremendous learning opportunity and the next thing is going to be great. So let's keep that in perspective as we kind of move ahead. And yes, it's wonderful that companies are now building plants here, but we can build plants too, and we have those ideas, and we don't have to go out anymore to do those ideas. We can stay in Canada and do them.
Great. Yeah, I heard the acronym FAIL is first attempt in learning. So perhaps we need to adopt a little bit of that mindset and really make Canada a critical part of the supply chain in life sciences and biomanufacturing, and recognize that we are going to rely on suppliers outside Canada, but we have to make ourselves a critical part of that supply chain, which will ensure that we have access when we need it. Let's come to you, Rav, for some closing thoughts and perspective, something that you want to leave our audience with.
Yeah, thank you. And I like the comments that Omar and Michael made, so I'm not going to repeat some of those, but let me add to it. I agree. It's this tragedy has put in front of us a fabulous opportunity. And we've talked about biomanufacturing, we've talked about the ecosystem and so on, but something we maybe haven't so explicitly talked about, which I think is important, is that biomanufacturing is the manufacturing of these important medicines, let's say. And in fact, over the last probably decade or two, small chemicals have been increasingly replaced, such that probably more than 50%, certainly more than 50% of global sales of medicines now are biological medicines. So there's huge opportunities. So what I'd like to leave the audience with is that, where biomanufacturing may be the kind of the final stage of it, let's say, there's a whole other array of things prior to that, which is the discovery and development of new biological medicines and vaccines. And one could argue that this actually presents a greater opportunity than a few manufacturing plants in Canada. The new medicines coming out of Canada. So I think it represents a great opportunity.
Great, a new age of discovery. How exciting! Let me go to you, Chris.
Great, thanks. I think just to reinforce something that's been a kind of a common thread since the start, I think that's the role of the universities in supporting this whole biomanufacturing ecosystem. And I think as Rav pointed out, there's the research end of it. As Michael's pointed out, there's the whole manufacturing scale. And as Omar's pointed out, there's the whole creation of talent that wants to become entrepreneurial and launch the startup community. And I think that's what the universities are well positioned to do, and that's to build this foundational talent, the interest, the skills, and to just build the resources that are needed to make Canada a kind of biomanufacturing giant, to be able to support these enterprises as they scale, to provide the expertise, and to provide the foundational insights that are going to lead to these new companies going forward. So we see a huge opportunity. It's going to require a lot of support. I still want a mock GMP facility to train my students. So I will join Mike in the push for a specialized institute, because I think these are the kind of things that universities are positioned to make the long-term investment in training the talent pool, so that when things happen like this, the pool is there and we can turn them on and we can switch them into that mode. So we are there to be the incubators. I'm excited by what the future holds for universities in terms of meeting this mission.
Well, that is a great note to end on what's been a fascinating panel. And I want to thank each of you, Chris, Omar, Michael, and Rav, for sharing your expertise with us tonight. We really appreciate it. I also want to thank our sponsors, TD Insurance, Manulife, and MBNA, for their support of the Disruptors Speaker Series through the University of Toronto Affinity Partner Program. And finally, I want to thank each of you, our audience members, for joining us here tonight and contributing to a rich discussion in another installment of Disruptors and Dilemmas. So with that, on behalf of the University of Toronto, I adjourn our discussion today. Whether you are near or far, we are thankful that you joined us, and I wish you good health and good spirits. Go well. Thank you.